Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Money Macro Talks, where we explore current events like Trump's America threatening Greenland and kidnapping Maduro through the lens of social sciences like typically economics, or in this case, international relations. Today, I am super excited to say that I have two amazing guests, Professor Stacey Goddard, who is Betty Vrijhof-Johnson, 44 Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College, and I have Professor Abraham Newman, who is the director of BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University. And they together have written this, I have to say, absolutely fascinating paper called Further Back to the Future, Neo-Royalism, the Trump Administration, and the Emerging International System, which really helped me make sense of the Trump foreign policy and the massive changes in the international political system that we are seeing today. So, welcome to you both. Perhaps I can start with you, Professor Goddard, Stacey. Can you maybe explain to us what is neo-royalism in a nutshell?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having us here. It's probably easiest in some ways to before defining what neo-royalism is, to talk a little bit about what it's not. Basically, we're at a moment that most people believe that we see this decline in what we call the liberal international order, which is really what we've known since the end of World War II. You know, an order that in kind of its ideal form, which of course it never actually hits, is governed by principles of shared rules, international institutions that are supposed to secure collective security, economic growth, so on and so forth. And everybody understood basically that this was in decline all the way back to at least the first Trump administration. And the general sense then was that we're now going to enter into this world kind of back to the Westphalian order, a world of territorial nation states, and ultimately of great power competition. And what Abe and I saw is just a lot of evidence that this isn't what's happening. Right? That instead of great power competition, where you see the United States, for example, attempting to get an advantage over rivals like Russia and China, we see a lot of collusion, right? A lot of attempts by Trump to work with these various other actors, really for his own gain. So what kind of system does that mean we're in? And this is what we get to in describing a neo-royalist system. And the general idea here is rather than a system of territorial nation states, rather than a system of rule-governed institutions, what we see is a system of international politics that's structured around the interest of ruling cliques, which include a personalist absolute sovereign, and basically his network of whether or not his family, whether or not it's financial interests, ideologues that legitimate his rule. But this is the kind of founding organizational structure of the international system. Trump and his ruling clique, and what he sees are other similar ruling cliques in the international system.
And just to punch it home for the listener, these earlier systems, either the liberal order or the Westphalian order, they were based on national interests. And different ones, security, wealth, some different, it varied. But this system, what we're arguing, it's not about national interest. It's about this small group of hyper elites, this clique actor kind of cluster's interests. And so that really drives a very different logic of how international politics functions.
Yeah, and that is something that can immediately be used, I think, to explain some of the things we're seeing right now in the news, right? That are very confusing if you take maybe a realism kind of look at the world of national interest, like you're mentioning, like why take Greenland? Okay, strategic interest, but they're saying they already have a base, they already have access, allies have Greenland. Same for Venezuela, right? They're saying, why capture Maduro if you keep the regime in place, if the oil is really difficult to get out of the ground? You have all of these difficult to square actions, right? That's really what grabbed my attention. Can you maybe comment on how this does fit into this new royalism framework?
Totally. And I think, you had the release text from Macron today by Trump, where Macron says, I don't really understand what you're doing. And that is iterated by like every world leader. And I think most just average listeners is kind of what is driving this? And so what we're really trying to argue is that on the one hand, the how of decision making is changed. We're not talking about a deep bureaucratic structure of decision-making that was typical of both Westphalian states and of the liberal international order states. You might call them Weberian bureaucracy. It's like, how does foreign policy get made? It was a deep interagency process. The president, the leader, had very little, decision-making. It was, they kind of got it siphoned up to them, and then they would approve or just, approve that final decision. That has all really been eroded, not because of Trump. It happened long before him, and it's happened in many other states. So if you think about Hungary or Russia, Turkey, this is a move to what we would call a personalist rule. You have a very brittle decision-making process. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, what is the objective? Why are decisions being made? And there it is about concentrating status and material resources for that insider group. And all those examples you made, what's going on in Venezuela, it's not about drugs. That's kind of the first thing that's put on the table. He just pardoned the former president of Honduras, who literally said, I want to shove drugs up the gringos' noses. And he was convicted for running a giant drug trafficking ring. Is it because of security? This isn't like the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were no missiles being based in Venezuela. There was by Russia or China. So these kinds of references to other explanations don't really hold water. And instead, what you see is that it becomes both an economic and a status resource for that insider group. So, who benefits from the Venezuelan oil? It's not your average oil company, but it's a small group of insiders. So Singer, he's a hedge fund owner. He happens to buy Citgo, the U.S. affiliate that really has a kind of a monopoly on processing the type of oil that Venezuela has. He buys it in November. And so he stands to profit tremendously. The oil sales are being run through, a Trump mega donor. These a bank that was run by a Trump mega donor, and Trump himself has said, I want to control the money in the oil sales. And so what you see is not a picture of this isn't China invading Taiwan to get access to a critical technology, semiconductors. This is creating a slush fund for patronage to distribute to that insider group. And you see with the claims on Greenland or Canada or, a whole bunch there, it's really much more about status. It's about saying states aren't equal in the international system. This is not one country, one vote. This is about creating a hierarchy in the system, that the U.S. is on top and Trump and his inner circle, if they want something, they can to get it, and that other people have to defer to his demands.
And how is this still, especially your example for Canada and Greenland, how is this still different from maybe Machtspolitik is a word I've seen thrown around. So, okay, the state, I could maybe argue the U.S. state is now doing Machtspolitik. It feels like it's in the national interest of the U.S. to be seen as the dominant state. What does it have to do with Trump himself?
Stacey's like...
So let me walk through Greenland, because I think this is just the perfect case, right? Because in many ways, let me start by spinning the Machtspolitik great power competition story. This story would say, look, the Arctic is melting. Greenland has critical minerals. There's going to be huge great power competition over opening shipping lanes. It totally makes sense for the United States to expand and influence. Here's the problem with this. First of all, as you already noted, the United States already has influence. Not only does it have a military base, it has rights to build as many as it wants. If it doesn't want to build a military base, Greenland is obviously, part of Denmark, an ally, and really ensconced in the NATO alliance. So a Machtpolitik explanation would tell me that you do things, yes, you want to expand your influence, but you do it rationally, and you do it in a way that minimizes the cost. And the United States is already in that position. Final thing, just on the why not great power politics, there was a great bit of reporting in The Atlantic just a week or two ago. The Pentagon has actually disbanded its office on the Arctic, right? In other words, the office that should actually be thinking about this in terms of great power competition, it's gone. So instead of doing this, what is the United States doing? It's making claims that are upsetting its allies, that are basically, driving Europe to actually, station a handful of troops there, and we could talk about that. It's pushing Greenland away. There's mounting evidence that this has very little to do with any sense of increased security interests and everything to do with either Trump's psychological state. What does he say in an interview? He psychologically feels that it's necessary for success. The Guardian just posted an article that says that part of the impetus towards Trump's interest in Greenland comes from the head of Estee Lauder being interested in gains in Greenland, right? So we also have all these other clique interest around. If I weren't reading this in reputable newspapers, I would begin to think I was a bit of conspiracy theorist, the way this has so little to do with the normal practice of great power competition and alliance politics, and everything to do with a sense of status and narrow financial gain. So in some ways you can run, since this is kind of a social sciencey podcast, you can run the alternative explanation and all it produces are puzzles. The United States is doing something it doesn't need to do at great cost to its ability to practice great power competition.
Yeah.
Can I just add, it's so rare in political science, especially in international relations, that you actually get smoking gun evidence of an argument. And the president is basically just putting it out there on a day-to-day basis. People don't want to hear it. I'm so confused, Macron, or, the prime minister of Denmark said the same thing. This confusion is because you're using the wrong lens. You're using the Westphalian and you keep demanding, this has to be great power politics that's going on. But he has said, I wanted the Nobel Peace Prize and you are not giving it to me. And so I'm going to engage in this behavior. He said in Venezuela, I want the oil. I mean, it wasn't, there's no vagaries in what the statements are. If you look at the national security strategy, which the White House released just a few months ago, Greenland isn't mentioned in the national security strategy. So if it is this great power politics kind of version of things, you would imagine that that would be the case. And I think one thing that is very difficult for, leaders, but also just average listeners to really integrate is that much of what is going on is also not about rational in the sense of maximizing interest for the general welfare. And so when you're saying, well, this isn't efficient, this isn't rational, it's because the objective is for that concentrated elite, for that small group. And the interest is not always just material, about money, but it is also about status. And here again, the Nobel Peace Prize thing always, it's like, I think for many people, they're like, this is just, it doesn't make any sense. But you can see that it is about a system of creating hierarchy, pecking orders in society. And that is very deeply human. I think Stacey and I always give the example of Game of Thrones. It's like almost everybody on Earth relates to this show about a small group of elites who really don't care about their societies in general. They just care about redistributing resources amongst these houses. And that is a system that for most of human history dominated international relations. And so this current world that we have that is, based on rules-based order is quite exceptional. And so I just think when we come to this kind of forcing things back into either great power politics or to the rules-based order, it runs in counter what humans naturally do, which is they impose hierarchy in social settings with each other. I could name a bunch of movies, Mean Girls, Heathers, whatever your analogy is. People relate to that because they understand that is how humans function with each other. And that's exactly what Trump is doing, is he's creating this pecking order and saying, I'm at the top. And if you're not, you have to pay the penalty for that. And it might seem ridiculous, but just ask, Narendra Modi of India, he would not say that Trump solved the conflict between Pakistan and India. And then what does Trump do? He slaps 50% tariffs on India. These types of social hierarchy, they can have real material consequences as well. And we're seeing that play out right now in Greenland as well.
Yeah, and the tariffs are also a puzzle for the realist great power politics kind of view, right? Because India is the natural ally to contain China.
Of China, yes.
Yes. And for a decade, the United States has been attempting to kind of woo India like into its sphere, right? And there was always a sense, of course, that India was going to hedge, that was good for it. But I mean, to actually slap tariffs on it today, it makes absolutely no sense from great power competition.
And so you've mentioned two critical things for me that I really want to dive into with you further. The material interest of the clique and the status aspect for the clique, which I think is more difficult to understand for most of the viewers of this podcast. But just before that, can I maybe do one last attempt with the great power competition story, and then you can break it down? So I read the national security strategy, and one big part of that is that they really seem to hate the Europeans, the MAGA circle, right? So I could also imagine, or first I read some stuff saying, look, and you write this as well, the European Union represents the last international order. It states, but, international institutions, that is the European Union. Trump hates this, but this we can also say, okay, but he's going for this great power politics order, so that's still consistent, maybe. Trump doesn't trust the Europeans. He thinks they're weak. He writes it down. So he needs to dominate the Western Hemisphere. He doesn't mention Greenland in the strategy, you say, but he does mention the Western Hemisphere. Greenland's part of it. So he needs to do this alone. And therefore, this makes sense for the national security of the United States because Europe cannot be trusted. What would you say to that story? Is that consistent, or can you break it down for me?
I mean, first of all, there's just an argument that you do better if you have Europe, and that is something that most administrations were defining as part and parcel of great power competition. Europe might not be the military power that, and I'm not just going to say Trump, that a lot of United States administrations hope it would become. Although it always kind of wanted both the military power and a dependent one, but I'll set that aside for a moment. But the United States obviously was counting on Europe as a counterbalance to Russia. It was counting on Europe as a market. It was counting on Europe in terms of intelligence. This is why questions, for example, of 5G networks became so prominent under the first Trump administration, as well as the Biden administration, right? The idea of actually securing communications networks, intelligence networks, so China couldn't actually infiltrate into them. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, one could tell a narrative that, you just like to keep Europe subordinate and you don't trust them. But in terms of the rationality of maximizing power at limited cost, it doesn't fit into that framework. But what you did hit on the beginning, and this gets into many the ideological points that you mentioned you were interested in, is it does make sense if you see Europe as the last holdout or one of the last holdouts of a rules-based international order based in liberal legitimacy. And in that case, yes, you do want to subordinate it. So I think that there's an answer to a puzzle in there, but it's not an economic one, and it's not even a material. It's not even a military one.
Yeah. Okay. So getting now back to neo-royalism, you mentioned, okay, look, if you dive into a lot of these cases, you'll find that the Trump clique benefits financially. The US does not benefit financially from Venezuela, but the Trump clique does. The US doesn't benefit financially from Greenland's minerals, but the US clique maybe does. Isn't this something that's always been around? Isn't this something that's been sort of, when scholars talk about oligarchy in the United States going back a long time, isn't this something that many have whispered around for a long time? Like, what's really different here?
So I think there's something just really, this is a really important point, which is the standard story in economics, but also in political science, is that large firms push governments to do things that those large firms want because it'll be in their benefit. And that is not the picture of what you're seeing right now. What you're seeing is authority, government, using markets to redirect resources to some groups and to punish others. And that's a very different model. And so let me just take a step back and I'll use the example of tariffs. So what the tariffs, everybody's like, oh, tariffs, no major US company was pushing for these tariffs. if you went to the U.S. American Chamber of Commerce and you said, what do you think of this proposal? We're going to slap, 40% tariffs on some of our trading partners. There would have been no clamoring for this. So I think it's very difficult to get this from the major corporations were just driving for this, and they've been lobbying for years to get this happen. So what does it do? Is it creates a threat environment, basically kind of like a protection racket, where the government says everybody's exposed to this new penalty, this cost of coercion. And now you, the target, whether you're India, Vietnam, or Apple, you have to come and tithe. You have to give us something so that you can get a better deal, so that you can get out from under these tariffs. And so you've seen that both countries and companies engage in this kind of behavior of going to the administration and saying, we don't, this is terrible. We need something else. And we are willing to give you something. And then in response, often what happens is economic and status resources are channeled to that insider group. So Vietnam, for example, they're threatened with really high tariffs. And then all of a sudden, a Trump hotel golf course, it's like $1 billion, endeavor development deal gets fast-tracked. You get Japan gets threatened with huge tariffs. And then they come out and they say, we'll give a $500 billion investment vehicle, which then has very shadowy governance structure, where it's kind of Lutnick, the commerce secretary, he'll create a board and they'll channel that money into, it's unclear. It's not going to be, I don't think, a competitive bidding process like you would anticipate for these kinds of funds. And the companies face the same kind of environment. So, Apple risks their semiconductor inputs. So then, they go to Trump and they give him a gold iPhone and they get exempted. And we're not clear exactly what the deal was. What did they have to give to get that? But we do know Apple is contributing to the ballroom project that Trump is doing. It's Apple's one of the donors. So, and that's just replicated across the economy. You can see that as well as in the Venezuela case. Exxon basically says, this is too risky for us. And then Trump says, well, then you're going to get excluded from, the way I redirect this endeavor. And so companies are being disciplined and countries are being disciplined. And their response is that they should then tithe in order to get out from under that. And that just, it further consolidates the economic and status resources of the insider clique.
And how does the clique? So, okay, let's say I'm sufficiently convinced to drop the realism story, the great power competition. We're now moving into the world of cliques. How can I think about these cliques? Who are in them? You mentioned in the paper, it's not just about Trump. It's also happening in other countries. But how does this dynamic between cliques work? And you also mentioned that some leaders, like European leaders, are not in these cliques. I've seen some interesting evidence previously that actually made me think about your paper, in the sense, like, for example, Mohammed bin Salman texting with and bugging Jeff Bezos's WhatsApp or via his WhatsApp, his phone. And then also in the Epstein files, you see Epstein talking with lots of foreign leaders, like also MBS, I think. And does this give us a glimpse into the world of cliques, and how should we think about cliques? What motivates these people? How do they live? How does it work?
I think the system looks very much like monarchy and its court in, for example, 16th century Europe, right? So, and you can kind of build it out in various circles. Obviously Trump for the United States, Trump at the center. Family becomes incredibly important. We can think about the role, for example, of Kushner negotiating in Ukraine. We think about the role that Donald Trump Jr. has played in negotiating various deals, oftentimes for the company. A few weeks ago, there was a profile in the New York Times. I can never pronounce it. It's Donald Trump Jr.'s ex-fiance, Kim Guilfoyle, who's been ambassador to Greece and is clearly also, I guess once you're in the family circle, you can be there for a long time. But I think there are also really important ties. Obviously, we've been talking about the financial ties to people who are willing to not only willing to fund this clique, but are also in return receiving spoils from actually supporting it. To also, I think, ideological sources, which I think are really, really important. I mean, so this is part of the MAGA group. This explains the position of people like J.D. Vance, of Stephen Miller, who are providing various kind of narratives of why this is okay, right? Why it is legitimate to be behaving like this in this particular moment. So all of this kind of, forms this internal clique. And then in terms of the question of who is actually in the clique, I think this is difficult because it becomes part of this like psychological processes of recognition, right? It is all, at the risk of sounding really ridiculously academic and ephemeral, a lot of times it is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's no accident, even I think, that Trump goes to the Gulf states at the beginning of this term. It's a recognition of this other clique operating in the international system. I had the audacity to take a day off from being online this weekend to focus on other things, and I come back, and there's this board of peace. I think that's going to tell you a little bit about who Trump and others see as members of the kind of international clique system in contemporary global politics.
Who is on the board of peace? I also missed this.
Oh, you've missed the board of peace?
Yeah.
Well, for just $1 billion, you too can become a permanent member of the board of peace. It's so who's been invited? She's been invited. Netanyahu's been invited. Gulf states have been invited. Abe, have you managed to dig into the membership of the Gulf of Peace?
Well, so this started as a way to manage the Gaza peace process, but at least the current iteration Trump has proposed, it would be used for a broader set of conflict resolution. And you can see it's an effort to kind of undermine and replace the existing conflict resolution institutions, aka the UN and the UN process, and it's to create kind of an alternative body. But it is a very, it's like you have to pay $1 billion. Trump oversees the budget somehow of this organization. And he did invite, I think, the G7 members as well. But at least the reporting right now is that they've all declined quietly, to be honest. But I do want to stress, in terms of the clique, this idea is that you see a set of personalist rulers, whether that is, MBS or Orban or Putin. They're following, it's a very similar structure where governments use authority to channel resources to these insider groups. And so there was a great expose, I can't remember, I think it was the New York Times, about how EU funds were being used by Orban to enrich insider groups within his society, both family members, but also kind of lifting up some oligarchs, you call them, and then kind of sidelining others. And the difference between MBS or Orban and Trump is that they just don't have the material or status capability to transform the international system. And that's why Trump is so exceptional, because he has the U.S. military and the U.S. economy behind it. Orban can't threaten Greenland, in this kind of way, and can even be disciplined by the EU. The EU has the power to say, we're going to cut off your funds, and that would then shrink his power base. Where at the US, it has such a preponderance of economic and military power, he has the ability to kind of force this reordering of the system.
So if I take a little bit of a bigger picture view of the system that you're proposing, you're saying, look, this neo-royalist stuff, it has been around for a long time, maybe even forever. But what makes it significant now, what made you write the paper, is that Trump has the power to make this the dominant international system. And it are like, there's maybe 3 different international systems that are competing for dominance: the international liberal order, the Westphalia system, and the neo-royalist system. And we're not yet sure what will emerge, but what's significant is now that the neo-royalists have maybe pulled ahead. Or if you could, is that correct?
That's a really nice description. I think what Abe and I are ultimately arguing is these are really unsettled times. And I think that there was a misplaced certainty in the type of system that was going to emerge, right? That this ultimately, it was a liberal order, or it was great power competition. And, somehow we've entered up at this point of history that there are no other options. And I think, Abe and I are saying these people who have advocated this type of system always been around. They've always kind of appreciated this vision because ultimately it helps themselves both in terms of material gain and in terms of status. And now with having such a powerful order entrepreneur at their back, we need to take this seriously. We need not to just sit back and say, I'm confused, or even worse, hey, maybe if we just tiptoe around it, like it'll pass. And then we can get back to like these two other alternatives that are clearly the only way the international system can be organized.
And I would just stress this system, the neo-royalist order, it's based on extraction for the few. It is not about generating, the rules-based order was trying to generate wealth for the most people, as kind of the open trade system, the kind of the idea behind it was, if we all have openness, then we can have more stuff and then more people will have stuff. And if you look at China over the last several decades, that is what happened is it was the largest anti-poverty program that existed in humanity's history. This system is not that. It is not about, there were problems with that liberal order. And, of course, it wasn't distributed perfectly. And, people can poke a lot of holes in it. But the objective was reaching for that kind of goal. This system, the objective is to extract resources for the very few. And you could just see that in like the case of AI and AI systems. The purpose of AI systems is not to, generate wealth for the most people. It is about to replace people and workers in most places and then to extract for these large companies. And if you think about what once again, the smoking gun evidence, what does Musk say he wants to do because of this is that he wants to build a colony on Mars for his family. I mean, that's not a general welfare story, maximization story. It is the kind of the absurd logical conclusion of what a neo-royalist system delivers. And if you look in history, that is what for much of history, people experienced. Think about the Spanish, mercantilist system. It was a very similar model. Think about Louis XIV. This was not, these palaces that were created were not for your average person. They were for the very, very few.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
not to jump in, but like even great power competition, I want to be careful here. I don't want to say great power competition somehow is a social democratic paradise. But even then, states kind of have to invest in structures that end up providing social goods. So you want to increase nationalism? You're going to need an education system, right? You want an industrial base? Also education, healthcare. So again, I'm not saying it's the ideal for human society, but it's not purely extractive. So I think that there are ways in which we're going to be grappling with this, not just as international relations theorists, but say as, all of humanity for a bit.
Yeah, and extractive as in to not serve the state, but serve the clique, right? Like, and if we go back to maybe royalist systems to serve sort of the house, the family, and just going back to that, original maybe royalist lens, because I've also watched Game of Thrones, and I know sort of there they give you a little bit of a peek, like, okay, how are these people thinking? They're thinking about their legacy, right? They're thinking about the survival of the family rather than survival of the state. But I still find it a little bit difficult to apply that to the Trump family because of the election cycle. Okay, we've seen, and maybe he'll tell me that he's trying to get rid of that, so that would make sense. But he's also quite old. In my view, real royalists used to think about this: I'm the king, and so the next king will be my child, and that dynamism is gone, right? So how should I think about how to maximize for your clique?
Well, I think first, as we talk about in the paper, even in dynastic systems, the historical ones, the idea of the family was often quite loose. So, it didn't always have to be the first child. And, sometimes it was a relative of somebody else. Like you can have a more expansive version of who is the heir. And often these were contentious. Like it wasn't always simple. If you think about many of the wars that happened in Europe or in Asia, it was about succession. And so I think in our argument, succession is in these systems is very likely. So they have so much resources that are concentrated around this clique. It's very easy for the clique to continue to pass on those resources, but it's often a point of instability. And so if you're taking our lens, you should think about this moment of succession not as that this order will just go away. I mean, look at the House of Saud. It's like it doesn't just go away when these succession moments happen. It figures out a system but it could be a moment of instability. And you'll see this, I think, because many of these rulers, whether it's Xi, Putin, Trump, they're all old. And so we are about at the international system to experience what I would think is a very destabilizing moment in international politics if you have this neo-royalist lens. But I would caution listeners to think, well, it'll just go away. You already see an institutional and an intellectual apparatus building around this structure. So Peter Thiel, he's been very adamant about democracy's kind of limits. There's a set of intellectual advisors around J.D. Vance who have called for, we need a new aristocracy. And at the same time, the economic actors, they are investing in this system. So, Trump does a deal with UAE about semiconductors, and now Microsoft has made huge investments in that deal. If somebody comes around and says, well, actually, we need to go back to a, great power competition, UAE is an untrustworthy supplier for, because they might leak this technology to China. Well, Microsoft will now lobby likely to keep that deal. So, I think we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that this is easy to unwind because there are both intellectual status and economic interests that have embedded themselves in this type of order.
Is this dynamic that you mentioned in the paper where you say, look, in the past you had these royal houses and you had these very wealthy banking families, for example, that sustained each other. Should I look at it like that?
Yes, precisely. And it's the way in which all the institutions come together to kind of create this really symbiotic system that allows it to sustain itself, right? So in terms of thinking about, old monarchical systems, yes, you're talking about the dynastic houses and the courts, and you're also talking about the financial system, right? Which again, I think we should stress here, because I was thinking about those oligarchy, these are the pre-capitalist systems, right? These are the guys against which the capitalists of the 18th century are mobilizing against, right? So they are the radical movement at that point. So the financial houses, but also, institutions like the Catholic Church, right? The legitimating institution as well. And they all come together and eventually they understand that their very existence and power ends up keeping each other in control. Now, Abe and I don't think we're at that point yet, but we're saying if you just wait 4 years, all of this stuff becomes more embedded in international politics. It becomes more stable. It becomes more difficult to unseat.
Hey, and what I always find interesting is, okay, if there's a new lens, how can we apply this lens to better maybe predict the world, in the sense that as an academic, we like to make limited predictions. And also, I think many watchers maybe are investors or they have a business. So if I'm looking at, if we're going back to your 3 lenses, international liberal order, okay, I'm really following what the IMF says, maybe, right? I'm following what the dynamics in the UN, or I'm reading international law carefully. The more power system I'm watching, I'm listening to John Mersheimer, and I'm looking at what is in the national interest of the various great states in the royalist system, and I want to know what will happen next. Should I look at, the big royal houses, cliques, and maybe study their interests? So maybe I should actually know, given that part of my job is to tell something about the global economy, should I next look into the Trump clique, what their interests exactly are? And that may actually help me to predict better the world. So, for example, had I known that these oil refineries were inside the Trump clique, I could have maybe seen Venezuela coming. Or, should I look at it like that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's both thinking about what are the insiders' interests, of in the clique, and that is, ideological as well as the economic interests. So, the Venezuela policy, for example, is being driven as much by Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller for different reasons. For about domestic politics for Marco Rubio, he wants to court the Cubans and Venezuelans, and Stephen Miller because he wants deportation agreements. He wants Mexico to collaborate. So he's using this as kind of a demonstration of threat. But that means that markets are not being driven by markets. They're being driven by power, by authority, and the decisions of the state. And you just see, it's so, I don't know, for me, if you're a major business, you have to be thinking about what we would call geoeconomics being driven by the clique interests. So NVIDIA, their policy right now, this isn't a policy that's being about competition and markets. This is about how do they court the Trump house so that they can get benefits, and they have to tithe because of that. They have to give this 25% export tax to do it. And so to think about, the future of where you need to look, it is both about what are the interests of the insider clique, but also the decision-making structure, which is very brittle. It's very narrow. Who's making these decisions? This isn't about lobbying the Commerce Department's export controls division in order to give, like the traditional way would be give feedback on rules. There's a rules coming on some issue. I should be engaged in that process. This is a very narrow set of actors who are making these decisions. But I will caution, I think this is what Stacey's last answer was, is that the more economic actors normalize themselves into this behavior, it has very destabilizing consequences for their own economic benefits going forward. The capitalists were the ones who were the radicals who were trying to depose the dynasts, because it was not about a rule of law. It was about capricious decision-making of economic actions based on how it would help the court. So yes, if you're, in the short term, there's ways to game this order, but in the long term, it will only undermine your economic interests because it will create this kind of capricious nature of the market, which no firm benefits from.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that, thinking about predictions, and this has come up, I think, in a lot of what we said already, are the importance of these status conflicts, right? And, and even areas in which it wouldn't be surprising to see a turn from kind of collusion to confrontation. So, for example, between actors like Trump and Putin, right? So I think that, Trump very much wants to collude with Putin. I think Putin very much wants to do whatever the hell it is Putin wants to do. And I think at some point that's going to become a problem because Putin is not as inclined to recognize Trump for who Trump thinks he is. So I think, but again, and that will be an interesting moment. And then perhaps maybe you can have us back to explain why it's not great power competition. Because it's probably going to look a lot like great power competition. It might even look like liberal international order stuff, but I think it's going to be a lot more personalist.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there are these kind of macro dimensions that are useful for firms, which is, succession becomes. What are the points of kind of instability in the system where the old, the great power conflict, it's more about like competition over, a national security interest. So Taiwan's a flashpoint. But in our model, Taiwan becomes less of a flashpoint, but really the succession moment becomes, a period of great instability. And so I think that helps, people think about what is likely to be a problem. Similarly, is like in the great power competition model, allies, that's usually not where conflict or issues emerge. In our model, why is Europe and the United States, why are they so incompatible in this moment? Europe doesn't have a neo-royalist actor. There's nobody at the head of a state that has a personalist regime that Trump really can engage with. He wants that legitimacy, but there's nobody there. So the only thing he can do is undermine the European Union because it's about rules. It's about, a process of checks and balances and saying, well, you can't do that. And that's not how these neo-royalist actors play. And so you should expect conflict between the US and Europe because their system orientation, what is the future of the kind of world they want, is in tension with each other. And not to go too deeply in history, but this type of kind of order competition is something that was actually quite common in earlier periods. So there was a period where you didn't have nation states. Nation states were just developing. And instead you had city states, you had the Hanseatic League, you had these different ways that actors organized international affairs. And at some point they go to war with each other, not because of, material interests or because the organizational unit was different, and they did not want that. They didn't want competition. Somebody saying, well, nation states are illegitimate. You can't do that. And that's why, why does the EU negotiate with regional organizations, with Mercosur? Why do they want an agreement with Mercosur and not Brazil? Because they want to justify their form, that the way they engage in the international system. It's almost like, thinking about like a body and a virus. It's like we need to exterminate this competitor. And so, even though it doesn't make any sense materially, I think you'll see a lot of tension between the US and Europe because of this difference in the kind of the vision of what the international order will look like.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's very interesting. Final question, as a European, could it be that we are thinking about reacting to Trump the wrong way, in the sense that, you have the Greenland incident right now. Trump threatens new tariffs against Europe. Europe is now considering, retaliatory tariffs against the US. But if your view is correct and it's not about the US interest, it's about the Trump clique interest, should the EU actually maybe respond as it has responded to Russia in 2014 by sanctioning or tariffing the Trump clique rather than the US state as a whole?
I mean, I feel like I need to let my co-author, Mr. Weaponized Interdependence, talk about this. I mean, yes, part of the idea of dealing with the network is to target the network, right? The only people, as we know, that bear the cost of tariffs are the larger population, right? So it's time to actually use something that is in our financial toolkit, in the global financial toolkit, and that's smart sanctions. And that's understanding that you can make individual people within networks bear some of the cost. And by the way, to be clear, that's not an easy solution. That's going to be extremely costly to everybody involved. So if you don't buy our story, if you think you can sit out the next 4 years or however many years, go for it, right? Because this is not going to be a pleasant move. But I think a combination of that plus being able to get European countries to be in a place where they are no longer threatened by basically being a vassal of the United States by dependent on, U.S. defense industry. These are the moves that Europe needs to be thinking about.
I mean, on the one hand, I think just to emphasize what Stacey said is Europe needs to chart its what I would call like positive agenda. What is Europe for? What is its version of where the international system is going? For too long, it's just kind of sat in the shadows of the United States and kind of deferred to the US. And I really think in order for there to be a healthy transatlantic partnership, you need a strong Europe, one that can say this is where the world should go. And I think the Mercosur agreement is one version of that, but it has to be in a much more coherent logic. It can't just be we're hiding in the background, kind of seeking out partnerships, where we can try to survive. It needs to strengthen itself internally, and that probably means making bold moves, like I would say Euro bonds. No European leader wants to hear that. They're all like, or no German leader wants to hear that. But it's like the U.S. is saying right now to the world, we're not going to subsidize your militaries, and we're not going to subsidize this open trade order. And we want more of the money. Our tariffs, we're going to use these tariffs to try to get things from you. We're trying to, we want both economic tithing, and we also want resources and all these different things. So if you're Europe, then the logical response has to be, this is a fundamental break, a once-in-a-generation break from the way we did business, the way we organized our militaries and the way we organized our economic policy. And so we have to go to our societies and say, this is going to cost something. There has to be solidarity now in Europe to say we need to revive our economic model and we need to revive our military model as well. It doesn't mean that the U.S. will always be an adversary or that we need to threaten the U.S. directly, but we do need to be capable to defend our interests. Russia can barely move the line in Ukraine. And yet Europe is really kind of like, oh, well, I don't know if we can afford to, do this by ourselves. Well, then you're only going to be a vassal. If it's like the richest country or richest region, the bloc in the planet. It has so much resources. So I think that I'm always trying to give a pep talk to European colleagues and say, you have the capabilities, you have the resources, but you need the political will to do this. And it requires a change in mindset. We are not in a world of the rules-based international order, and it's not even about great power competition in the traditional sense, because then the U.S. would still kind of have a similar footing vis-a-vis China. And so Europe is really going to have to step up. The final point I would say is that, it will require Europe to take sometimes bold action vis-a-vis Trump and his inner circle, but that could often be just as much about status, about making Trump pay politically for doing these things. He doesn't want to have costs. Most of the time when he threatens things, he doesn't actually have to go through with the threats. Why does he go through with the threat against Venezuela? Because Venezuela can't do anything. It's punching the weak kid in the schoolyard to show everybody else that you can punch. But Europe isn't the weak kid in the schoolyard. They should be able to push back and say, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. We will not accept this. Instead, their political costs are so tepid. They're saying, like, we don't agree with this. That's not going to get you anything. I would say both be bold in your political vision, but also stand up for the order that you want to play by. Otherwise, it's going to evaporate.
All right. Thank you so much. This was a super interesting a lens to view the world. And, I would love to go into the history in way more detail, but we are at the end of already talking about this for an hour. And if people want to go into more detail, I really recommend that they should read your paper. I will link it in the description of this video and podcast. And thank you both so much for coming on.
Thanks again for a great conversation.